Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Gender History, a very short introduction, by Antoinette Burton, narrated by Kitty Hendrix. Introduction. Gender History in Context. When people think of gender history, they're likely to imagine a particular kind of academic work, involving scholarly books and articles that make ideas about masculinity and femininity evident in all kinds of times and places, in order to tell a story of difference, discrimination, struggle, and visibility, and of equality between the sexes. And that would certainly be right. Gender history has been an academic field since the 1970s. It has several well-established journals, an intergenerational array of award-winning practitioners, and an equally impressive bibliography that addresses the role that gender has played in shaping histories from the Neolithic period to the present. It has been a global phenomenon as well. Historians who work in and write about virtually every quarter of the planet have tackled the question of what gender has meant in their societies and what impact its histories have had right down to the present. Even its critics will admit that, together with women's history, gender history has been one of the most significant developments in the discipline since World War II. The history of gender, in law, as culture, and through identity politics, is an enduring, powerful provocation on both the global stage and in everyday life. One has only to think of how we talk about gender history when we talk about the comedian Lucille Ball, the black women scientists in the film Hidden Figures, the future of the workforce, or historic firsts, like the election of Angela Merkel in Germany, or Kamala Harris in the United States. Narratives of gender history can be found, too, in the rise of autocrats and in sports culture. Whether we are talking about Benito Mussolini or Rodrigo Duterte, FIFA management, or transgender athletes. While conversations like these are not the focus of this book, such common examples remind us that gender history is not merely an academic question. It matters in consequential ways to every arena of public and private life, the world over. This volume is designed to introduce the scholarly field of gender history, its origins, development, reception, recalibrations, and frictions. It offers a set of working definitions of gender as a descriptive category and as a category of historical analysis, tracing the emergence, usage, and applicability of these entwined subjects across a range of times and places in the scholarship since the 1980s. Inevitably political, gender history has taken aim at the broader field of historical narrative by asking who counts as a historical subject and what difference gender difference makes. It has also been concerned with how attention to gender in history subverts reigning assumptions of what power, culture, economics, and identity have been in the past, with ramifications, of course, for what they are today. Now widely recognized as a key component of historical methodology, gender history and the first gender historians struggled for acceptance as historians. That may seem remarkable today, but it reminds us of the precarious place from which the field began, and, of course, of its relative newness in the long historical scheme of things. Because gender history takes shape, like all history, in fact, intense and tender relationship to the times it inhabits, any introduction to it must grapple with the fact that the very centrality and stability of its key category, gender itself, has been in question across its whole history as a field. Scholars of class and race and ethnicity have challenged the isolation of gender from other axes of identity, calling for an intersectional approach to both the study of gender and its work in the world. Queer and transgender scholars, themselves shaped by racial and social difference, and often influenced by post-structuralist thinking, have questioned the binaries that can undergird gender history, asking us to appreciate gender not as fixed or original, but as constantly troubled, and as continuously performed in specific contexts. What is intriguing and ultimately defining about gender history is how and why it has run up against voices and forces that take exception to the singularity and the sovereignty of gender itself as an explanatory category. These powerful, unruly tensions are at the heart of this very short introduction, and they suggest some of the ways that gender history has channeled wider crisis of political and cultural authority since it took hold as a disciplinary field. Over the course of several decades of teaching gender history, I have often been struck by the linear progressive narrative through which the interrelated components of the field are recounted. Students and even some faculty colleagues tend to imagine that women's history, with its recuperative, compensatory impulse, came first, and that gender history, with a more sophisticated, analytical lens, followed. Then came intersectional critique from Black women and scholars of color. And now, in the wake of queer and trans histories, which have, it is said, blown up gender as our grandmothers knew it, we have moved to the most progressive plane of all. As viewed from 10,000 feet and run through an unselfconsciously liberal approach to political change, this might seem a reasonable take. Indeed, such an approach is effectively pegged to assumptions about the historical relationship of women's movements to civil rights, to marriage equality, to LGBTQ+. That is, they happened one after the other, with key moments of connectivity, perhaps, but serially and in progressive fashion nonetheless. There have undoubtedly been consequential shifts and changes in how we think and write about the past as a result of how gender history as a field has emerged. Yet progress is at once too easy and too glib a description of how and why this is so. One goal of this book is to dispel the notion that gender history has either ridden or driven an arc of progressive development. For one thing, gender history has always been embedded in and crosshatched by a combination of research and teaching that question the primacy of gender itself, questioning produced in the shared context of women's liberation, civil rights, LGBTQ+, and decolonization movements of the late 20th century. By the same token, gender history has not surpassed lesser forms of practice, nor been superseded by superior forms of radical history writing. Born of a specific set of left liberal scholar activist formations, the field of gender history is one expression of the histories out of which it comes, one change agent, albeit an important one, among many. The vibrancy of gender history in all its plurality today is fed in part by the investment so many people continue to have in the power of gender and the power of history combined, to illuminate social and political crises, in the past and in the present. Its archive of insights and its ever-adaptive methodologies, even when flawed, mean that gender history remains critical to all dimensions of historical practice, whether inside or beyond the discipline of history per se. What I have described so far will sound like a very Western story, and in fact a very white middle-class North American perspective. It is important to recognize the movements for gender equality were, and are, thought to be key to modern Western progress. Progress identified by some with the American century, typically periodized as the era of U.S. hegemony, after 1945. Gender history as a field has been caught up in the domestic and international politics of that extended moment. One of the leading scholars of the field, Joan Scott, is an American historian of France, who has challenged the border between academic work and political life, such as when she appeared as an expert in the legal case brought by working women against the Sears Roebuck Corporation, or when she published her work on the Muslim veil, linking its ban in France to the failed politics of post-colonial assimilation. It is arguably a testimony to her influence, and that of other scholars, that American gender theory is vilified in Europe as a kind of American contamination, and not only by right-leaning regimes. In this context, gender history as one aspect of global conversations about how gender can and should work is a lightning rod for an array of geopolitical debates and crises. Accounts of gender history that point to its white, middle-class, and Western origins are readily available, thanks to radical women of color, Angela Davis, Hazel Carby, Gloria Anzaldúa, Cherie Maraga, Chandra Mohanty, Bell Hooks, to name only a few, who posed anti-racist challenges to mainstream feminism, and whose work has circulated globally since the 1960s and 1970s. Yet this troubling history may come as a surprise to listeners unaccustomed to thinking of gender history as a predominantly Western phenomenon, and also to those who assume history itself as a discipline is untouched by geopolitics, especially of the inheritances of modern racism and imperialism. Meanwhile, for some scholars working through the practices of gender history, the question has arisen as to whether gender is anything like an organic concept outside Euro-American society, let alone beyond its academic institutions and its professional organs of dissemination. Given that, in demographic terms, the vast majority of its practitioners reside in the United States and Europe, gender history as a field continues to reflect many of the struggles that have characterized the 20th century histories from which it has emerged. Gender history has not been immune, then, from the imprint of either U.S. politics or Western colonial legacies, and its social life as an intellectual formation has been rife with challenges. Those challenges have come from Black, Brown, and Indigenous scholars in the United States, and from those from formal colonial societies. They question not simply the singularity of gender, but equally its legitimacy as an analytic, because of its historical emergence in and through the very warp and weave of colonial and post-colonial histories, because of the ways that binaries of gender can themselves be so bound up in imperial histories, and because history, as a Western discipline, thinks most often through the time of the modern, the temporality of gender history has been an issue as well. That is, scholars working in ancient, pre-colonial, and pre-modern periods worry about the modernist biases that gender history methodology carries, to such a degree that the gender in gender history can, if we are not mindful, be construed as a Trojan horse for a plethora of ahistorical interpretations. Beyond its accomplishments, its struggles for recognition, and its limitations, gender history is hardly innocent of the historical conditions that engendered it. As a scholarly field, it offers ample evidence of the limits of the March of Progress storyline in which it is often situated. Given the rise of fascist and right-wing politics globally, it is surely time for the fantasy of modern liberal progress, whether in politics or the development of historical fields, to be punctured. I read gender history not as a site of progress, but as a field of inquiry that is symptomatic of the many crises, social, political, methodological, out of which it developed and in which it continues to operate. My goal is to get and keep gender history out of isolation, so that we acknowledge the various conditions that have generated and will continue to sustain its work. I use 3 strategies toward this end. First, I make visible the field's historical and ongoing connections to arenas like women's and queer history in an effort to refuse the progressive destiny that is often implied about its trajectory. Second, where possible, I seek to recall the social movement contexts in which and out of which gender history emerged, in the United States and beyond. That kind of overtly political connection, by the way, partly accounts for why gender is eschewed, especially by scholars who prefer their histories to be above the fray of politics. And finally, I'm interested in how and why gender history is hardly limited to the confines of academe. As a way of thinking about the past that prioritizes a range of identities rooted in notions of male and female, without seeing them as timeless or essential, gender history and the stories it tells are everywhere in contemporary culture the world over. As a lens for rethinking conventional accounts of politics, the social, economics, religion, labor, and even history, with the capital H itself. Gender history is a resource for everything from the #MeToo movement to alt-right conspiracies, struggles against global capital, Black Lives Matter, or a stand-up comedy act such as Hannah Gadsby's Nanette. I make a distinction here between gender history and gender studies. The latter is an interdisciplinary field often institutionalized in academic departments, and sometimes organized adjacent to ethnic studies or other interrelated units and spaces of Western higher education. The former typically has no given institutional home. Its practitioners may be in history departments or in gender studies programs. Academic jobs advertised as gender history are rarer than ever, as are jobs in women's history. Though positions in queer or trans or indigenous or Latina/Latino studies may include references to gender history as part of their remit. At the same time, the history in gender history can be misleading, for its practitioners often draw on multiple interdisciplinary approaches, as do most practicing historians in any case, even as they think about the contingency of time and place as a major structuring lens for interpretation and explanation. Evidence and archives, these remain critical, though the way such sites are themselves seen to be steeped in the presumptions and values of the past that gender historians are often invested in upending, remains a productive tension in the field. But even in its most radical forms, gender history valorizes methods and practices that try to capture the ways that, as the editorial collective of the journal Gender and History put it in 1989, the creation and reproduction of gender is a historical process, unfolding in the specific conditions of any given moments and places. Now to my own position in relation to the field of gender history. As a white U.S.-based feminist historian of modern British imperialism, who has done work on South Asia, South Africa, and empire at home, focusing on women, race, the global and, most recently, animal worlds. My training as a researcher and my experience as a teacher inform every aspect of my approach to the subject, as does the time of my emergence as a historian. Born in 1961, and having earned a Ph.D. in history in the United States in 1990. I am a cisgender scholar who came to age intellectually and politically just as the powerful combination of decolonization and feminism was shaping the ways that history was done, the ways that gender was mobilized, and frankly, the ways that the Anglo-American world order of the pre-1940 era was experiencing a global crisis. I do not have a complete sense of how those histories shaped me, but I do know they have afforded me a set of convictions about how gender works and what history is capable of doing. In keeping with the expectations of the field of gender history that partially made me, I acknowledge the subjective, if nonetheless rigorous and principled, character of my approach here. I'm also skeptical about the possibility of objective, disinterested study, a posture with which my long-standing engagements with women's, feminism, and empire history have equipped me. As a child of the historical conditions and crises that have given rise to gender history, it could not be otherwise. As a listener, I would ask you in the same spirit, where do you locate yourself in these histories? As a field, gender history has been extraordinarily influential in shaping several generations of scholars and students, myself included. More conspicuously, perhaps, the eruption of queer and transgender communities into the socially mediated public sphere over the course of the last half-century has made gender newly available to many as a way of talking about identity, belonging, alienation, and history, too. Some of the same historical conditions and struggles that have made that emergence possible have also made gender history. The story of how male and female came to be understood as a pairing, a binary, and what that undoing can or should look like. A powerful political, economic, and cultural resource for individuals and collectivities alike. In that sense, gender history might be said to be hiding in plain sight, at work everywhere we look. A clear-eyed grasp of how gender history arrived as an academic field is certainly important for understanding how research and teaching in the humanities, the social sciences, and beyond have been shaped since the late 20th century. Even more consequentially, appreciating the ways that gender history lives in the world is key to unlocking what our experiences of contemporary life may mean for us, and for whatever comes next. Chapter 1. Some Origins of Gender History as a Field. The year 1989 was a monumental one. The Berlin Wall fell. Protesters occupied Tiananmen Square. The Loma Prieta earthquake, magnitude 6.9, disrupted the World Series. The Soviet-Afghan War ended. The first GMO trial was launched. South Africa held its last election under apartheid. The rap group NWA's album, Straight Outta Compton, reached 1 million sales. The Family and Medical Leave Act was reintroduced in the U.S. Senate. The Ayatollah Khomeini issued a fatwa against Salman Rushdie. The first global positioning satellite, GPS, went into orbit. Riots provoked a state of emergency in Argentina. A tornado in Bangladesh killed over 1,300 people. It was the 20th anniversary of Stonewall, and Denmark became the first nation to legalize same-sex unions. Barbara Harris became the first woman bishop in the Anglican Episcopal Church. Francis Fukuyama wrote, "The End of History." In 1989, no women won Nobel Prizes. Margaret Thatcher completed a decade as UK Prime Minister. Mark Lepine gunned down 14 women at the University of Montreal Engineering School after shouting, "I hate feminists." More than 2/3 of the women in jail in the United States had children under the age of 18. The musical Miss Saigon became one of the longest-running shows on Broadway. In 1989, Lucille Ball, American actress, died. Elena Ceausescu, Romanian communist, was executed. And Gender and History, the first academic journal dedicated to gender history, launched its first issue. The premise of the journal was straightforward. As the founding statement from the editorial collective, Why Gender and History, proclaimed, the journal brings to the study of history the centrality of gender relations, and to the study of gender a sense of history. The editors sought to examine all historical social relations from a feminist perspective, to construct a comprehensive analysis of all institutions that takes their gender-specific characters into account, in addressing men and masculinity as well as women and femininity. The journal will illuminate the ways in which societies have been shaped by the relations of power between women and men. What followed was a powerful case for the work of gender as a site of historical experience, meaning, and significance, and an avowed commitment to examining all aspects of gender in all places, in the home and in the workplace, in the neighborhood and in diplomacy, in play and in war, in private relations and in parliaments. Attention to the limits of the public-private divide, to the importance of masculinity as a right and proper subject, to interdisciplinary approaches, to histories of all times and places, and to the inclusion of non-professional as well as full-time historians. These are the dimensions of what the journal identified as a gender-oriented approach to history. In this term-setting context, gender was defined as not only a set of lived relations, but also a symbolic system. Here, symbolic meant metaphorical, even allegorical, a means of exploring the way that gender attributes structure representations of units, such as the nation, whether as motherland or fatherland, for example. At the same time, the editors were keen to make it clear that their project was to bring such forms of descriptive analysis into dialogue with attention to relations of domination and subordination. This articulation of the tension between the representation of gender and its embeddedness in material social relations is significant. It suggests that gender history began its professional life as a bridge between scholars invested in social history and those taking the turn toward discourse, with its emphasis on language as the mediator of power relations, and on textual analysis as a means of accessing power dynamics. Sometimes called the linguistic turn, this emphasis on texts as mineable resources for social and cultural history was a methodological innovation that feminist scholars often championed. As an opportunity to think through interdisciplinarity, it offered the possibility of examining history and its limits when it came to what the historian Kathleen Canning called key words in the vocabulary of social history, women and gender among them. Apropos, and unsurprisingly, given the journal's title, the discipline of history, its male practitioners, and its resulting male bias came in for scrutiny from the start as well. For men, the editors wrote, one of the great privileges of being in a superior position is being allowed to claim that identity as the norm, and to treat that hierarchy as natural. This is as true for the study of history as it is for the historical past itself, since it is men who have, by and large, been responsible for the doing and writing of history. It is their definition of the legitimate historical project which has prevailed. Through the exercise of such privilege, they silence the voices of the less powerful and simultaneously deny a genuine examination of their own dominant position. They celebrate divisions which function both to organize gender relations and to ordain masculinity. This, the editors argued, must change. That imperative required not a rejection of men, but rather a gendered history aimed at understanding how male actors saw their actions as contributing to their positions and resources as men, and how such activities defined men as separate from and superior to women and the feminine. Yet for all the sense of balance the editors brought to this opening gambit, they were plain-spoken about the stakes of the work for the profession itself, because, as they observed, the expanding interest in the place and meaning of women's lives in the past still remains, for the most part, outside the main body of historical writing. What they hoped to accomplish in the journal from the vantage point of 1989 was to bring women and gender, and in many cases women as gender, into the mainstream of history as a professional discipline. And if they fell short of saying that the practice of history would itself be transformed, they insisted, with what I think of as a combination of understatement and cheek, that gendered history calls for the exercise of the highest degree of historical imagination. That meant not just seeing women, but...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?